So what Hebrews 12 has been trying to make very clear to us is that whether we know it or not, and whether we want to or not, you and I are in a race. There is a race that God has asked us to run, and maybe you're running it, or maybe you're standing at the starting line wondering where everybody else went. But whether you know it or not, there's a race, and we're called to run it. And it's not a race that we get to define, and it's not a race that is like the race of the world. It's a race that God defines. So unlike the world, the race we're running is not one where we're trying to find success by accumulating a lot of things and accomplishing a lot of things and making a name for ourselves. That's not the purpose of the race that God is calling us. And contrary to popular belief, it's not a race that tries to count how many quiet times you do, how great your church attendance is, how much of the Bible you've read, and how many good deeds you've done. It's not that kind of race that God is asking us to run either. The race that God is asking us to run, as sort of revealed in Hebrews chapter 12, is twofold. The race, in one sense, is individual. It's our race, and it's a race that we run in pursuit of God so that in connecting to Him, His presence transforms us to be more and more like Him. It's a race that we're running so that we become more Christ-like. It's a race where we're not trying to accumulate blessing, we're not trying to collect blessings, but it's a race where we're connecting to God so that He can use us as a conduit of blessing to the rest of the world as He makes us more and more like Him, more and more as an image bearer of His name. It's this ongoing pursuit of Him. So there's this individual component where you and I are focused on connecting with God to be more like God, but there's also this corporate component to this race. And we saw that last time I spoke in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 to 15. Look at the language here. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, right? And so there's this corporate aspect to the race. So just like we don't get to define this race as us accumulating things, it's also not the same race that the world runs, where the world runs this race where everybody else is seen as competition. And everyone else is seen as getting in your way because there's only limited resources. And so if Chris gets the resources that I need, then I'm held back from running my race. That's not the race that we're running, where we're trying to get ahead of everybody and that we win the race when we finish first and everybody else finishes second, third, fourth. That's not the race. The race that God defines is pretty much this corporate race where our lives are intertwined with a community that is also running the race. And our race is one in which we make sure we invite others. Hey, come run with, not me, but come run with us so that we can see, like in verse 15, that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. So there's this inward focus to the race where we're focusing on our relationship with God so that we become more Christ-like. But there's very much this outward focus to the race where we're running together as a body and inviting other people to run with us. That's the race. We don't define it, God defines it. We don't define the goal, God defines the goal. But one of the main reasons that the author of Hebrews is using this analogy to help people understand the Christian life is not just because it's very relatable, but because they understand and they want to acknowledge to the audience that, like many times when we run the race, there are going to be times where we will want to give up, where we will want to stop running. For the Hebrews, because of their faith, all of a sudden their relatives were against them. Some of them were losing property. They were being persecuted. So the Hebrews, they must have thought, if I would just stop running this race, life would be so much easier. And I know sometimes as we're doing this Christian thing, there may be times where we want to stop and say, I just want to stop running this race. And that could be because something big hits our lives. I've seen many people that stop running the race because of a death that they see in their family. And they begin to question God's goodness because why would God let this happen to me? Why would God let this relative die? I've seen people stop running the race because of something catastrophic that happens at their church, some sort of church drama, church split, some sort of scandal. I've seen people stop running the race because of those sort of difficulties and seasons. But there's also times where we stop running the race honestly because our heart's just not in it. Our heart's not in it. And that doesn't happen immediately. That sometimes happens over time as the race just wears you down, where you go through the motions, but your heart's not in it. You come to church, but your heart's not in it. And so really, even though you look like you're running the race, you're really standing still because you're not pushing forward anymore for whatever reason. So the race is hard. Christian life is hard. There's many times and temptations where we may want to stop. And so the author of Hebrews is trying to acknowledge to them, I know it's hard for you right now. I know the things you're going through are difficult. And same thing for us. God is trying to acknowledge to us, I know there's times you want to stop. I know there's times where the race gets tedious or boring or whatever it is. There's times where you're just carrying too many burdens to keep running, But acknowledging that it's hard, there's still encouragement that the author wants to bring in chapter 12. And one of the things that Jason Van talked about is one of the ways he's trying to encourage his audience and also encourage us is to remind us that these difficulties is actually God training us to be more and more like him. And the fact that we have difficulty shows us that what? God has his hand in our lives and is not just leaving us alone to struggle and to flop around and be directionless. Right? The fact that we go through these difficulties is the method and the vehicle that God uses to actually draw us closer to him. That there's these disruptive seasons in our life sometimes that God uses to give us a bigger picture of him. I just think of Israel. Think of Israel. Here was their journey. Their journey was, okay, God's going to give us this promised land. But then it takes 40 years. And then what was Israel's mindset? God is going to bring his kingdom through this kingly line of David. But does that happen? It doesn't. The kingly line ends. So if you're an Israelite and you're thinking, God is this, God is going to do it this way, and then all of a sudden God doesn't do it that way, that difficulty, that sort of dissonance is sometimes God's way of opening us up to a bigger picture of who he is. And now they have to struggle with, wait a minute, God didn't do it the way I thought he was going to do it. He didn't save my nation through these kings. These kings ended. So what is God really up to? And then what happens to Israel? They get captured. They're put in captivity. Where's God there? And then they expected what? God's going to come and he's going to bring this person to overthrow these governments that are oppressing us. And he doesn't do that the way they think he's going to do that. After one empire oppresses them, the next one comes and oppresses them. So now as an Israelite, you're having to wrestle with, I've been running this race. God is not doing the things I'm expecting him to do, so now what? So that is an opportunity, I think, where God's going to explode our tiny boxed-in picture of who he is and how he's going to do things and show us actually that he's much bigger than we ever thought he could. And so those times when you're running the race and it's like, where's God? God is not answering my prayer the way I expected him. God is not providing for me the way that he promised to provide for me. It's actually an opportunity for God to say, wait a minute, you've tried to put me in this box. You've tried to think that I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do something much bigger. And so like the Israelites, they now have to think, wait, maybe God is not just about our nation, but God is actually about a much bigger nation, about the world. Saving the world, not just us. Now the Israelites have to think, wait a minute, the God that's coming is not this grand king, but this humble servant. And that's a very much different picture of God that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to explore had they not gone through times of difficulty. And so these seasons that we go through are opportunities for God to train us, show us more of who he is, to transform us into his likeness. So that's how one way the author has been encouraging them to run the race is keep going because the tough times is actually God working. There was a second way that was really subtle last time I spoke via video of how the author is trying to encourage people to keep running the race. And what he does is he's actually reminding the readers, and may the Spirit remind us that the reason why we can keep running this race is because of God's grace. And he did it in a very interesting way. The way the author did it is he contrasted these two mountains. So could we put up the picture? He contrasted Mount Sinai, where God spoke and gave the Ten Commandments, and Mount Zion, which is sort of this promise of God's kingdom. Now, Mount Sinai was this picture of God who was scary, very distant. There was thunder and earthquakes. It's not a place you wanted to be. You didn't want to be near God, near the God of Mount Sinai. Because if you approach the God of Mount Sinai in your sinfulness, you will get destroyed. That was the picture of God in the Old Testament. But what the author of Hebrews is saying is, you're not called by the God who did it that way. Instead, you're called not to Mount Sinai, but to Mount Zion. The picture is very different. The picture was a celebration. The picture was a party. The picture was this culmination of God's kingdom where God ultimately wins, and now we're celebrating with the angels and singing with the angels, and there's joy, and there's peace, and there's love all abounding. And so the author's point is this. The relationship you're called into is not this one, because this one is about rule following. This one is about burden. This one is about law. And if you break the law, that results in your death. The picture you're being called into is this one, where God is inviting you not into a death sentence, not into a scary place, but inviting you into a rejoicing place, where he bought the ticket for this celebration because you could never afford it. So what you're being called into is not life under the law, but life under the grace of God. So keep running. Because we're not running a race where our mistakes are going to destroy us. We're running a race and going towards a God who's inviting us in a personal way, not a distant, disembodied voice now that's in this scary mountain, but God is inviting us in a personal way to come and have a relationship with him. That's why you can run, because you're under a covenant of grace. You're called to belong into a community that looks like this, that is vibrant and shining and joyful, celebrating. So just kind of as a side note, do we, in our lives and as a church, just question, reflect Sinai to the world, or do we reflect Zion to the world? Both as a church and individual. I'm asking this because I forgot who I was reading, but I was reading this author, and they had this thought that if an alien visited on a Sunday, like visited Earth on a Sunday, and they sort of took a survey of where God is, right? And that alien comes and looks at church. Sometimes church is what? A bunch of like dull, boring people that are like burdened and feel sinful and down like this. But when they look at outside of church, where they see people partying it up and celebrating and having sort of all this fun, right? And so I just began to question, like, if we're called into Zion and now not Sinai, are we reflecting that? Are we showing the world life that's full of grace and joy and fun, not guilt and burdensome rules, as a lot of churches do sometimes, right? Because this Christian life is serious, but there's also serious fun and joy, I think, that we need to have. One of the commentaries I read said this: if we do not live joyfully, reflecting the reality of the heavenly Jerusalem, of Zion, how can we invite people into that reality? So if we're not living a life of joy, of fun, of vigor, of rejoicing, of partying, how can we ask the people, hey, run this race with me? It's an awesome, fun race, right? I'm not saying that we put on fake smiles. Just a thought, okay? Are we running in a way that paints the correct picture of this race we're running, where it is fun, it is full of joy, it is full of love? Or are we running a race that's saying we got to obey these rules to be Christian? This is what a Christian looks like, talks like, sounds like, right? Just a thought. So there's this encouragement, right? Keep running because God is training you. Keep running because we're called into God's grace and not God's law only, right? Keep running because we're running for a kingdom that is full of joy and rejoicing and peace and love. But there is a final warning that comes with this encouragement. So this is our passage for today, verses 25 through 29. Here's what the author writes. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, yes, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So what's the warning? The warning is this: yes, you're invited into a celebration, but guess what? You have to accept the invitation. And if you don't accept the invitation, there is no plan B. This is it. God's ultimate plan was Jesus. There's not going to be another way. God's not going to, a few years down the line, go, oh, wait, there's actually another way that you can come in. There's actually another way I want to relate with you. This is it. If you're waiting for another way to be in relationship with God, you're going to wait a long time. And this is not just in Hebrews 12. If you look at Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 2, it says this: long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Look at verse 2. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. That's it. Jesus is plan A. Jesus is the final plan. These are the last days. So if we don't accept this invitation, there's not going to be another type of invitation. This is it. And I think it's important for us to be clear as we're running this race and as we're inviting people into this race, to be clear that this is the only way. Because this world is full of philosophies that say what? There's many ways to God. Many ways to God. Most of my family is Catholic, and I remember talking to my cousin, and he said, Catholic God, Muslim God, all the same God, just different expressions. This sounds great. But according to the Bible, no. This is it. It's Jesus or nothing. Right? And so as we kind of unpack this passage, I need us to remember this Zion versus Sinai dichotomy, because that's actually permeated throughout this as we dig in. Okay, so just remember, there was this understanding of there is this God of Sinai, scary God, condemning God, fire, earthquake, distant God. But there is this God of Zion, celebrating God, joyful God, inviting God, loving God. So there's that dichotomy. Okay, so let's look at verse 25. Verse 25 says, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. Okay. So there's a sudden shift in tone, right? Because here's the tone. This race is hard, but keep going. Because God's disciplining you, God's training you, God loves you, God's inviting, God's trying to call you into this grace, but don't refuse it. There's this shift in tone. It's very jarring to me, where on one verse, the people are being encouraged, and then in the next verse, the people are being warned. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is the author is asking us to hold in tension this picture of God in Sinai and this picture of God in Zion. Because to us, it feels like two very different gods. Scary, angry God, loving, welcoming God. But what the author is reminding us and asking us to hold in tension is this duality that the God of Sinai is still the God of Zion. It's the same God. There's this God with these high holy standards that we cannot meet, but there's also this loving God who invites us in and pays the price for our ticket in. And so when he says, look, they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth. Who's that? That's the God of Sinai. The God of Sinai said, do these things. And every single time, Israel broke the covenant, and they didn't escape the wrath. They were punished. That's the God of Sinai. So he's saying, if this God, that God, back then, they didn't escape that God when he spoke, how much more are we going to be in trouble if we don't listen to the God who spoke from Zion, from heaven, the loving God, the welcoming God, the God who paid the price? Do you see the argument? It's both, right? There's God who spoke and was scary, and there's God who speaks and is loving, but it's the same God. Oh. And so if they didn't escape the angry God, how are we going to escape responsibility for rejecting the loving God? Scary, right? But again, this goes all the way back to chapter 2. Here's what chapter 2 of Hebrews said. Therefore, we must pay closer attention to that which we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by the angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received just retribution, here it is again. How shall we escape if we neglect such great a salvation? It was declared first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect such great a salvation? Right? And so it's this warning of this is it. This is God's ultimate plan. And if we are not accepting of it and accepting the invitation, there's no other escape, because guess what? The God that invites us into Zion is the same God that demands a lot of us out of Sinai. So that same God who spoke then is speaking now. And the way it ends is this, and here's where we're going to kind of land. The same God who shook the earth with his voice, thunder and earthquakes, that same God is going to shake the earth again. The God of Sinai who shook that mountain is going to come and he's going to shake the earth again. Look at verse 26 to 28. At that time, his voice shook the earth. That's Sinai. But now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. That's Zion. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, the things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. So what's the promise? There's going to be this final earthquake. Not literal, maybe literal, I don't know, it depends how you interpret Revelation. But there's going to be this final shaking, and that final shaking is going to test everything. In college, my background was mechanical engineering. So one of the cool things we got to do is we would take these earthquake generating machines. I kid you not, there's these machines that generate earthquake. We would bring them to like a dam. And we would cause the machine to simulate an earthquake on the dam. Why? Because we want to know if the dam can hold up against a real earthquake. Sometimes they would do that on the library while I was studying in there without warning anyone. And so the library would shake. And you'd be like, why is the library shaking? Right? And you've seen this too. This is how they test buildings. They have these big shaking tables. They make a model of the building and they shake it. Why do they do that? Because they want to know, will it withstand the real thing? And so what these verses are warning us is there's going to be this final test, this big shaking table that's going to see what's going to last and what's going to be destroyed. And what the author is saying, what God is saying is only certain things will last, and specifically the things that will last are things of God's kingdom. Zion. I grew up in California. So guess what? Earthquakes, I'm a veteran. Right? I remember, anyone, I don't know if not that. Okay, let's, 1987, there was what's called the Whittier Narrows. Would you remember that? Yeah. And so I was on the bus, and I just remember I'm standing on my school bus, and the school bus starts doing this. And I didn't know what was happening. I found out later there was a huge earthquake. The whole street had cracked down the middle in the city of Whittier in California, and it was pretty bad, a lot of damage done. I've lived through many earthquakes. Right, you know, I've lived through the Northridge quake, which if you remember that movie Speed, I think they had to jump over that bridge, right? Things like, I mean, I've lived through many earthquakes, so I kind of have a sense of what's a big one and what's not, right? And it's funny because when I came here and earthquakes happen, people who are not used to it freak out, right? And they don't know what to do, and they're very scared. But to me, I sort of have this sense of like, yeah, it'll be fine. Right? Like, it's okay, you know, because you know when you're in trouble. You can kind of tell when you're in trouble. Usually when it does this, that means you should be in trouble, right? And so sometimes I look at the buildings in Taiwan, you know, and my kids wonder, I wonder, like, can it survive a big earthquake? And I use this flawed logic. Here's my flawed logic, ready? Well, it's survived this long so far, and it's been through many earthquakes. What was the big earthquake? When did that happen? When Taipei 101 was being built, and was it 2000? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Some big earthquake, right? You know, so I think, okay, well, you know, this building where the church is on has survived that one, so I'm sure it's earthquake worthy. That's my logic. right? I use that same logic with taxi drivers. Here's what I think. Sometimes you have a taxi driver who's driving crazy, and the passengers that are with me, whether it's friends from out of town or whoever, are like freaking out. And here's my flawed logic. I think, well, he hasn't died so far. So what are the chances that I'm going to die now with this person driving? I mean, he's driven this way his whole life probably and has survived to tell about it. So I shouldn't be scared, right? That logic was very much shattered by, I don't know if you remember Carrie and John Drozdak. Carrie, who actually went to my college, is also an engineer and very logical, and she said something like, past performance does not indicate future results, right? I was like, that is very much true, right? So even though I feel like, oh, these buildings are fine, I don't really know. I don't really know. But one thing I do know is this. Even though these buildings seem fine, there is no way that they won't eventually fall down with enough shaking, right? Even though everything kind of seems okay, with enough shaking, things are going to break down. And according to the passage, the only thing that will last for sure are the things that we do for God's kingdom. There are many, many worthy races you could be running right now. There's the worthy race of being a good parent. There's the worthy race of philanthropy, worthy race of self-improvement, worthy race of community service. But let me tell you, when the shaking happens, when God tests what will last and what will not, some of those things are not going to last if they're not under the umbrella of building God's kingdom. So even though, yes, you should run the race of becoming a good parent, you should run the race of becoming a good spouse, you should run the race of doing your best at your job, but that has to come under the umbrella of this main race that God is telling us to run, because only then will those things actually last. Only then will those things have any sort of eternal implications. So what does this mean for us? Okay. What this is a reminder for us is that you and I, we need to run the right race. And that race needs to be God's kingdom. We need to run the right race because it is possible to run the wrong race. It is possible to run a race that we think is pretty worthwhile, but in the end, it will not last, and it will not matter, and it will be shaken. It is possible to run a race that at the time being, the results seem very, 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 very meaningful, but if it's not under this goal of expanding God's kingdom, of becoming more Christ-like, as solid as the results are going to seem, they will not last. It is possible to run the wrong race. God's kingdom, to me, feels very upside down. Because sometimes the things that seem so solid are actually the things that are so fragile, aren't they? And the things that seem so much a waste of time and fruitless are actually the things that God uses to build his kingdom and the things that will last. The things that appear so solid to this world, that seem so sure, that just seem like they'll last forever, are actually some of the most fragile things there are in existence. Look at every empire. Every empire thinks they're so solid, right? Even growing up in the U.S., the U.S. thinks it's going to last forever. But that empire is going to fall someday. It seems great, but it's going to fall. But sometimes the things that we do that seem like, am I wasting my time? Is it really worth it? I'm doing all these things for God. I'm seeing no result. Those things that appear so fruitless, but when done with the kingdom in mind, are actually the things that will last. It's so backwards. It's so counterintuitive. You know where's the safest place to be during an earthquake in Taipei? Or a typhoon? Yeah. One of the safest. It's actually Taipei 101. That seems super counterintuitive, right? Because when you look at the Taipei skyline, say there's this really tall building, it's really skinny, and you're telling me that's the safest place for an earthquake, and that's a safe place for a typhoon, during a typhoon? It is. Why? Because it's designed and over-designed to actually last during an earthquake and during a typhoon. Right? We don't know what this building's made of. I mean, we heard all sorts of horror stories about some of the construction around Taipei. Right? But when you look at it, it's like, I don't want to be in a 101-story building during an earthquake or typhoon. But that's exactly where you should be. And I feel like a lot of times God's kingdom is like that, where it's like, I should pour my life into this because I get immediate results here. I get tangible results here, rather than pouring my life into this, where it's like painful. Do you think it's fun sharing the word? I mean, sometimes it is, right? But other times it's like, oh my gosh, does anyone care, right? But the things that last, the safe place to be is not always where the world thinks is the safe place to invest in, but it's always going to be investing in the Taipei 101, the thing that's designed to last, which is God's kingdom. So what else does this mean for us? It means that what we do for God's kingdom will not be a waste of time and energy. What we do for the kingdom of God will not be a waste of time and energy. Sometimes I know we do ministry or we do missions or we give and we wonder, does it make a difference? Does anyone care? Will anyone listen? Will anyone's life change? Does it matter that I'm there? Does it matter that I gave? Does it matter that I show up? Does it matter that I prayed? Yes, because that is running the race of God's kingdom. And according to Hebrews, that kingdom will not be shaken, meaning it will last. And so for times where we run and we are discouraged, like maybe you've been witnessing to a friend for years and nothing's coming out of it. Maybe you've been serving at church for years and you're just weary. Maybe, who knows? Maybe you just feel like nobody appreciates you. Maybe you wonder if there's any effectiveness to what you're doing ministry-wise. Maybe you wonder if giving that 100 NT does anything for God's kingdom. Yes. I want to say yes. Because that is the thing that lasts according to God's word. So what we do for the kingdom of God, even though now and temporarily may seem like it's not making a difference or not doing anything, it's sowing something and building into something and playing a role in something that is designed to last for eternity. It will not be shaken. Amen. Okay. Lastly, I'll leave you with this. What else does this mean? It means we need to trust God for our security. Because we spend an awful lot of time trying to make a foundation that we feel will last. Whatever that is. Right? A foundation in the relationships we invest in, a foundation in our future, a foundation for retirement, foundation for our kids. We try to build these structures that make us feel like we'll be okay. We invest our time and our money in things that set us up for comfort and security in the future. But you talk to anyone that's been hit with some sort of unexpected disaster, you talk to anyone that's really been hit with real life, and they will tell you that all these things that we set up to guard us and to protect us and to secure us don't do a lot of good when real difficulties come. That I don't care how much money you save, there are going to be things that could wipe that out like that. There are going to be structures and frameworks in your life that you have set up so that you will continue success. Some unexpected disaster could wipe that out like that. And I know that's not the most pleasant thing to hear. But what I'm trying to just remind us of is anything we build here for us will be shaken and will not last and will be destroyed by earthquakes, figuratively. The earthquakes that our life encounters. But I want to encourage us that even though sometimes it doesn't seem like it, even though sometimes it feels less secure, the times we invest into God's kingdom, the times we spend running this race, the times we spend trusting him and asking him and praying to him, praying with each other for these things, those are the things that will actually last and carry us through the storm and yield fruit into eternity. So let me read verse 28 again. It says, "Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. That's the race we're invited into. That's the kingdom God is trying to build through us. Okay, let me just pray, and then we'll spend some time sharing and praying together.